Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ASA section on Teaching Statistics in the Health Sciences spring webinar. My name is Maria Charleglio, and I am the current chair of the section. We are a section within the American Statistical Association devoted to excellence in teaching statistics and conducting statistics education research, specifically within the health sciences. Our goal is to promote communication around all of these activities to professionals interested in teaching statistics. If you'd like to learn more about our section, I encourage you to visit our website. We also regularly maintain a blog where we post about the different activities going on in our section, as well as different resource reviews and member highlights. We have many resources available for statistical educators. If you're looking for real-world data examples to use in your teaching, I urge you to join our section and look into our resources portal. Here we have many different data sets that are free for section members to use. Today for our spring webinar, we have a panel of individuals who will discuss successful approaches to teaching statistical consulting. Dr. Julia Sharp of the National Institute of Standards and Technology will moderate today's discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the TSHS website. And now I'll turn it over to Julia and our panelists.
Great. Thank you, Maria, for that introduction. I am going to first introduce the panelists. So I will start with Emily Griffith. Emily Griffith is an associate professor of the practice in the Department of Statistics at North Carolina State University. She is also the director of data science consulting in the Data Science Academy. Emily has a strong record of collaborative statistical work across a broad range of disciplines, including veterinary medicine, engineering, education, and paleontology. She teaches a collaborative undergraduate research class in addition to the graduate level consulting class at NC State. When she is not working, Emily enjoys cooking, spending time with her family, and running outside. Thank you for joining us, Emily. Next, I will introduce Alex Hanlon. Alex Hanlon is the director of the Center for Biostatistics and Health Data Science and professor of practice in the Department of Statistics at Virginia Tech. She has served as principal or co-investigator on numerous federally and foundation-funded research projects within a variety of clinical areas and has a prolific collaborative publication record. She serves on various data safety monitoring boards for drug development clinical trials and as a scientific reviewer for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, the National Science Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health. She teaches communication in statistical practice and has developed an undergraduate summer program for collaborative biostatistics for underrepresented students in STEM. Thank you, Alex, for joining us today. Next, I will introduce Ryan Peterson. Ryan Peterson is an assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics and Informatics at the Colorado School of Public Health. He serves as the director of the Biostatistics and Bioinformatics Core within the Pulmonary Division for the CU School of Medicine. His research interests include model selection, predictive modeling, data pre-processing, statistical computation, multidisciplinary team science, and missing data. His applied research experience is focused in the areas of pulmonary sciences, emergency medicine, and infectious disease. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us. And finally, last but certainly not least, Emily Slade is an assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Kentucky. She is passionate about teaching, practicing, and studying collaborative statistics, specifically focusing on how biostatisticians can integrate effectively into research teams. As part of this work, she directs the Biostatistics Consulting and Interdisciplinary Research Collaboration Lab at the University of Kentucky, also known as the Biostat Circle, which is a group that focuses on fostering research partnerships with biostatisticians as team scientists. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. I am Julia Sharp. I spent many years teaching and consulting in statistics and applied sciences, and it is my pleasure to join the panelists in this webinar today. So thank you for joining us. The format of our webinar today is we've prepared some questions and answers to those questions, and we'll spend the majority of the start answering those pre-planned questions. Following that, or interspersed, you are welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function that we have in this webinar. And if it fits into what we're talking about, then we may answer as we go. Otherwise, we will direct our attention to those questions at the end of the webinar. So our first question is really a statement. Tell us about the structure of a formal statistical consulting course that you have taught or would like to teach, including how many students you might be advising at one time. So we are all of the panelists are going to answer this question, and we will start with Emily Slade.
Thanks, Julia. So just briefly, at the University of Kentucky in our Department of Biostatistics, we actually have a 2-semester long sequence of statistical collaboration and consulting courses at the graduate level. And so what that looks like is that the first semester is a more controlled classroom-based experience, mostly role play type activities happening in that course. And then the second semester is an experiential version, working with real collaborators. And those courses typically have about 5 to 10 students at a time.
Great, thank you, Emily. Emily Griffith.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia. So at NC State, we have a 1-semester class. It's experiential with real on-campus collaborators from the beginning. So we have usually 25 to 30, but have had up to 45 students at a time. It's taken at the end of the master's program or near the end of PhD coursework. There is a 1 credit hour section that sometimes our PhD students opt to take instead of the 3 credit hour section, and it is restricted to statistics students only.
Thank you. And next we have Ryan.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy and honored to be here participating in the panel. So to answer this question, in our program, we actually have had a 2-semester course in consulting broken into fall and spring semester, so 1 semester hour each. And I've taught the fall semester only of that for the past 3 years, but this year actually we're changing it to a 1 semester 2 credit hour version, so kind of a little bit more condensed version. In this class, there is a mix of lectures and also real and practice consultations. The real ones are kind of a mixed bag of what's coming in, and then the practice ones are a little bit more set. I have about 10 to 20 students at a time in that class, and it's taken at the beginning of an MS or PhD program in biostatistics, but it's also open to others. So we do have a handful of people who are not a part of the biostats program taking it.
Great, interesting, thank you. Alex.
Thank you. So it certainly is a pleasure to be with you all today. So at Virginia Tech, we, meaning me and my team, we engage in 3 scenarios that involve formal teaching of statistical collaboration. So the first is a 3-credit course entitled Communication and Statistical Collaborations. And this course was created by Jennifer Van Mullicum, who delivers the course in Virginia Tech's Department of Statistics to anywhere from 12 to 32 undergrads, depending upon the semester. The course is actually capped at 40. And then what I did was I adapted the course to graduate students and to the health setting. And my classes are much smaller, and the class is taught in the evening to students who are working professionals in the DAS program in Northern Virginia. And DAS stands for Data Analytics and Applied Statistics. It's really a flipped format where lectures are watched outside of class, and then class meetings are spent reviewing the content and engaging in teamwork. It's structured around the McMaster problem-solving process, which is a framework that was originally developed for engineering, and then it was adapted by Jen to statistical practice. And this framework really it gives tools to the students to walk through the 5 phases of problem solving, which are defining the problem, exploring the space, planning the solution, implementing the solution, and then reflecting on the process. Secondly, we were just funded by the NIH to deliver an 8-week summer program to underrepresented undergrads in STEM. And this program is called CUBE, Collaborative Undergraduate Biostats Experience. And students attend the program at Virginia Tech and then remotely at UVA. And yes, that's it.
Great, thanks, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So our next question is about training. So we're here to talk about courses, but training can sometimes happen outside of courses as well. So the next question is, what informal statistical training do students get at your institution? So statistical collaboration training. So Ryan has the first response here.
Yeah, so here at CU, well, we have, as I said, a mix of MS and PhD students in biostatistics in our program. And through that, we have graduate research assistantships, which I would say are very heterogeneous in that some of them are very specific to like one project, and it might be a biostats or stats heavy project, but others are actually more broad and handle a wider range of projects in more of a role of like a statistical consultant or collaborator. In fact, the center that I'm a part of, it's called CEDA, the Center for Innovative Design and Analysis. We're kind of a part of a branch of the Department of Biostats here that is more externally facing towards other parts of our university, including things like the School of Medicine, here, Children's Hospital. And CEDA actually typically hires 8 to 12 students each year for help with statistical collaborations. These 8 to 12 students will mostly support the existing agreements that we have in CEDA with our partners. And so that's kind of one way that our students get some collaboration or consulting experience. We also actually have consulting clinics where medical students can receive one-on-one design and analysis consultation from our students. And we have learned a few lessons with this because often these students are coming in without any statistical consulting experience. And so if that is the case, we found that it does help to pair more experienced stat students with the newer ones. And also just to be very crystal clear from leadership what the expectations are for those sessions so that our students aren't kind of taken advantage of in those one-on-one consulting sessions.
Great, thank you. Next to talk about this is Alex Hanlon.
Okay, thanks. So as Julia mentioned earlier, I lead a collaborative team, and we hire undergraduate CMDA students as well as students in statistics to work with us on real world projects in a team science setting. So CMDA is computational modeling and data analytics. And we like for these students to work with us for as long as possible, preferably at least a year. So last summer, we had one of our students work with us on an R-Shiny app, actually for summarizing ASA chapter activities. And she ended up presenting this work at our Council of Chapters Governing Board business meeting at JSM in DC last year. And this gave her experience using R Shiny and also with presenting at a national conference. And it opened her mind to networking and the benefits of membership in an organization like the ASA. So then a second informal training outlet is through our virtual walk-in consulting hours. And we currently offer them 8 hours per week, soon to expand to 12. And these hours are heavily attended by the students who are looking for support on issues related to programming, power, sample size, methods, and so on. And like Ryan, a third informal training outlet that we have is through our advising the medical students on their domain projects. And these span over a 4-year program, and they are expected to result in a peer-reviewed publication. And that's it.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Our next question is, what are your favorite resources to share with students? And how are these resources shared? So we have 2 parts to this response. We'll start with Emily Griffith.
Thanks. Yeah, so I jumped on this question because it was a chance to plug some work that I've done with Julia Sharp and with Megan Higgs. We got a grant from the American Statistical Association, a member initiative, and made a series of training videos. They're freely available on YouTube. And the other nice thing about them that I think I almost like, I don't know, I like it about as much as the videos actually, but we have scripts and we have discussion questions and further resources that are available on Julia's website. And so sometimes I will play the videos in class and we'll go through some of the discussion questions. I've had really good luck with the videos. And then other times I'll make the students read the scripts in pairs. None of them have wanted to perform them yet, but I'm holding out hope that one day that will happen in class. But I have them read them and try different tones, and then we talk about how their conversation went in their group. So you can use it also more as a role-playing exercise. Thanks. Oh, and thanks for dropping the links in the chat as well.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to just also plug how great those videos are. I have been using them in my class since they've been out, and they're really great for fostering good discussion on how a statistical consulting process goes. Especially, it's a really like comfortable environment to kind of explore what happens when you're a statistical consultant if you've never done it before, to kind of watch these videos. And actually, like Emily, I'm going to plug something that I've been working on with Julia and Emily. It's called Stat-CTR. Or the Stat Consulting Training Repository Initiative. And this is kind of inspired by the videos by others on the panel, which I've been using in my class. I actually created a final project in my consulting class for our students to emulate these videos and create their own videos. And I was actually really impressed with how good the videos turned out. And I got so, excited by that I was inspired to set this up as a way to kind of share these different consulting videos in a resource repository that others can contribute to, including my students and whoever else is willing to put in that effort. Our goals with Stat-CTR are to really have a community-driven, reliable, and well-indexed set of resources and videos related to the training of the next generation of statistical consultants. We also combine this with what already existed as a well-indexed resource repository that Julia Sharp had put together. And so we just decided to put this, for now anyway, free and online. We hope it's helpful, and we encourage you to use it, or even to participate by submitting new resources and videos if you'd like.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. So Emily Slade, what are some resources that you share with students?
I love both of the resources mentioned by Emily and Ryan, so I'll definitely second those, but wanted to add a few other miscellaneous things. I'm sure many attendees to this webinar are familiar with Janice Durr's textbook called Statistical Consulting, A Guide to Effective Communication. If you're not familiar, I highly recommend this book. In particular, there are 2 chapters that I commonly have my students read and discuss, one on nonverbal communication and one on dealing with difficult situations. And I particularly like these chapters because they do a great job presenting some kind of example scenarios and are just kind of a good starting point for discussion on issues one may encounter as a statistical consultant that students may not have thought about before. So I really like those chapters. I also oftentimes draw some readings for my students from Gerald Van Bell's book called Statistical Rules of Thumb. In general, I'm not a big fan of statistical rules of thumb, but this book is offers some really interesting food for thought on aspects of statistical practice, I would say, or implementing statistical methodology that students may not have encountered in their traditional methods classes. So that book is also available free online, which is a big bonus. So I like to assign some readings from there. And there are aspects of that book that some folks may not agree with as well. And so that offers some interesting points for discussion in class about statistical practice. And then a third that I added on here is a paper that I like to have students read that was published in PLOS Computational Biology called Good Enough Practices in Scientific Computing. And so a big focus in my statistical practice course is on reproducibility and all those aspects around coding in good practices in programming when you're participating in collaborations. And I find that a lot of recommendations out there are, a lot of recommendations out there I think are great, but difficult to implement all the time in every situation. And so I think this paper takes a really interesting approach and it's good enough practices. That's a good starting point for those reproducibility conversations. So those are just three resources that I like to use each semester in my class.
Great. I love that. Good enough practices. Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, so like the rest of us, I also use Julia and Emily's article on role playing in my formal course. And this is such an excellent resource. Every week I incorporate a single role play video into the class time, and they consistently generate interesting and lively discussion. And we also use the ASA's ethical guidelines for statistical practice. And these guidelines nicely complement our discussions oftentimes when we're doing the role play scenarios. And then moving along through the list of references that Julia dropped into the chat. When we talk about statistical analysis plans and scopes of work, we also we use both Julia's and Ryan's articles that appeared in the 2022 special issue of Stat last fall. Another resource that we use all the time when discussing data sharing with students, and actually probably more frequently when we are working with our client collaborators, we refer to the Broman and Wu's article in the American Statistician on data organization and spreadsheets. That's very, very helpful when communicating with folks on how to share data with us for analyses. We also use several other resources that came through Jen's undergrad course, some of which include Brian Joyner's description of the skill set that's required to be an effective statistical collaborator. And this appeared in the Encyclopedia of Statistical Sciences by Coates et al. In 2005. And I think, Julia, if you haven't already, could you drop the list of skills into the chat?
I will get there. I'm trying to get it. Thanks.
Thanks. Another paper that we reference frequently is by Cass et al., and it appeared in Computational Biology in 2016 on the 10 rules for effective statistical practice. And we also really heavily use in various outlets Azad's 2015 article on the ADEPT, ADEPT method for explaining technical concepts. So ADEPT stands for analogies, diagrams, examples, plain language, and technical definitions. So we've hosted ADEPT workshops in the formal communications course that I talked about, as well as in the CUBE program that when we piloted it, and we will offer it in our program this summer, and also in WIDS conferences, Women in Data Science conferences that are local and regional to Blacksburg. And then finally, Nature Methods has been publishing a monthly column since 2013 on statistics. It's called Points of Significance, and it's targeted at biologists, but the articles are really useful for researchers in a variety of disciplines. And that's all I got.
Great, thank you, Alex. I will continue to try. I can't copy and paste for some reason, so I'll continue to try to get those over into the chat. Thank you. When we think about our successes, it might also be helpful for us to think about not so successful teaching approaches or collaborations. And so our question here is, what strategies have you tried that maybe were not so successful? And these can be hard for us to admit to. So thank you, panelists, for putting effort into answering this question. I appreciate that. So Emily Griffith.
Yeah, thanks. It was interesting to take some time to think back about things that haven't worked, because I think that's just as, if not more important sometimes than thinking about what did work. So when we first offered this class online, pre-COVID, we were really nervous about having client interactions in an online environment. We weren't sure what that was going to look like. And so we used canned projects is what we called them, where they were previous projects from earlier semesters. And we had like client information, we had data and questions, but no real client. And it was not great. The students did okay on them, but they really missed the interaction. And then the other thing was that a lot of the students sort of they were gently skeptical that these were real questions and real data, which wasn't a problem that we had anticipated. And then COVID forced everybody online, and now it feels kind of silly to say that we were worried about interacting in a virtual environment. The other thing is that when I first redesigned the course here, we had really light scaffolding. And so the main thing was, we had occasional check-ins where we were just like, how's it going? And then at the end of the semester, the first semester, a student group told me that they were still waiting for their data. And it was the end of the semester. And so I sort of laugh with some of my colleagues that I added a deadline every semester until I stopped having problems. But now we have like pretty substantial scaffolding through the semester. So they have to turn in notes from their first meeting. They have to write their written introduction and project description and research questions. Very early in the semester, they turn in a method section so that I can like check their plan. They turn in code at different points, right? So that you can really dig in and make sure that everything is going smoothly. And that has also not just helped our students, but it's also definitely helped the client experience because they're not getting sort of maybe slightly off kilter work that is unusual, perhaps from a student group that's newer to consulting or to collaboration. And so that sort of really thinking through like what pieces you need and what you can double check, and double checking things as early as possible is a lesson that we learned. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Alex.
Yeah. So I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what Emily just said. So very early on, I taught a class on advanced research methods, and this course was conceptualized by medical students, and they based this course on topics that they wished they had been exposed to in their academic training. So what they wanted was exposure to real world research problems, and then also experience publishing results from quantitative type of analyses of real world data sets. So I designed a course where I asked students to come to class with a research question along with a real world data set and an identified clinical collaborator who agreed to advise them in a team science model. So the idea I thought was good and it worked for some, but for others, really, it was an absolute disaster. So some of the problems that I encountered included, I actually saw students not even understanding the format of the data that they needed to answer the research question. And what I mean are some students came with summarized data that they had found as publicly available data sets. So they were in tabular format and they didn't bring a data set containing raw data. Or they realized on the first day of class that perhaps their data set comes with a hefty fee for access. And of course, no funding to support that. And so then they're, off searching for another data set. Or the study required IRB approval, which, as we know, can take weeks. It might take months. And then to get through the system, the project might be difficult then to complete within the semester that they were enrolled. Another challenge was that, I had asked them to have clinical collaborators, and these collaborators have very busy schedules, and mentoring students is typically not at the top of their priority list. So that was challenging. I've also had situations where the data set required so much cleaning or data wrangling that it made the analysis portion almost impossible again to carry out in the semester. I've also seen fatal flaws unfold, like a data set having too few events to support the proposed research question and data analysis. Or perhaps the project required methodology that went beyond the students' abilities, or conversely, the methods were too elementary, so the students were not challenged. So it's really it was a tough course to make happen. And then also sort of piggybacking on what Emily said, another more recent challenge that I have found comes with my remote teaching, especially when students have been working all day. So they might be so exhausted by the end of the day that they just really don't feel like keeping their cameras on, or they want to have time, they're running around and they want to have time to eat their dinner and so on. I've had situations more frequently than not that when we have students who are parents of young children, and there's a lot of throwing things and yelling, and it makes it difficult when the students are working in a team-based environment, and where we expect discussion and interaction. And certainly in these courses, these communication courses, reading body language is so very important. And I think that's all I have there. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Great to hear from you and Emily there. Thank you. What is a limiting factor for you in teaching statistical consulting? Emily Slade.
Sure. So when I first started teaching our collaboration course, the primary students taking that course were from our PhD program, which actually is a multidisciplinary PhD program that we share with the Department of Epidemiology. It's a joint epidemiology and biostatistics program. And so for that reason, students really came to that program from very different backgrounds and levels of statistical knowledge. Some students were having completed a master's in biostatistics, and so they had a really large set of methods in their repertoire. Other students had basically intro stat, and that was it. And hadn't really even seen generalized linear models or anything like that. So having students at really different levels statistically was challenging to structure the course properly, that everyone is able to get something out of it in terms of the communication and collaborative skills that were being taught. And in particular, being able to make sure that the actual projects that the students were collaborating on were at the right level, given their own statistical backgrounds. So that's been a real challenge, and has meant, if you recall from the beginning, that the courses I teach are fairly small in size. And so because there's a small number of students too, it means that the levels that the students are at from one semester to the next can vary a lot. So I found myself really I don't want to say redesigning, but the class varied a lot each semester. You know, I was kind of tailoring it on the fly to the students who I happened to have that semester and what their backgrounds were. So that was definitely a limiting factor in getting our course set up the way I would like to. A second factor is that I run a collaborative lab on campus, which is a great source of consulting projects, real projects for students to work on in the moment. But the problem is a lot of the people who fund this lab generally don't want the work to be done by students, or that's kind of like a stipulation of the funding. And so that's been a real challenge in trying to find a way to integrate students into our real projects as best as possible and also keep our funders happy.
Great, that can definitely be a challenge. Thanks. Emily Griffith.
Thanks. So sort of piggybacking off Emily's slate, I feel like we have a bit of a Goldilocks problem here, because I think one of the challenges is class size in our program, but it's on the opposite end, where it can be really easy to get overwhelmed with more than 35 students, especially if they're in groups of 2, which is, I think, my favorite size for groups in this class. And so that can just turn into a really large number of projects. I taught multiple sections once and then I'm like never doing that again. And so then I feel like it's easy to lose track of individual projects. And then at that point, the students aren't getting sort of that direct kind of support and help that they might need and benefit from. And that also makes it less likely that the collaborators who bring projects are happy, and that word spreads really quickly. So keeping the class size small, but maybe not too terribly small, is a bit of a challenge.
Certainly a Goldilocks problem. Thank you. Speaking of resources that we were talking about a little bit earlier, what resources would you like to have to contribute to the success of training the next generation of collaborative statisticians? Emily Griffith.
So I feel like my answer is ironic because I feel like I'm talking a lot right now, but I would love to have more voices in this, more examples, more ideas, more perspectives, and from like textbooks, like a really nice modern textbook that covered the consulting process for a classroom would be amazing. Any kind of example that you can get a hold of is really valuable and helpful. So I wish people would share and publish examples more videos and scripts, and a larger emphasis across the literature, I think, on communication skills, both written and oral, would be phenomenal. So just anything that anybody wants to contribute, I think there's room for, and that we benefit from a really big variety of voices from different institutions and different kinds of programs. And that helps people sort of hone their own personal communication style, because that is so unique to each individual.
Thank you. Ryan?
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more that more voices and more materials and examples would be very, very helpful. One, I was thinking about what I like, an ideal world, you know, what would I have for helping to teach this content? And I think one thing that would be very nice is a bank of recorded real consultations with discussion questions. Since I started teaching, my very first time was actually fall of 2020, when we were still remote, and I was trying to develop a new statistical consulting course in that environment. I actually thought it would be smart to record some of my Zoom calls with investigators and use those as like content for the course. And that actually worked really well. So that's one of the assignments in the class, is kind of to watch that real recording. And there's a bunch of discussion questions that go along with it. Like, why did I say this here? Or what should I have said differently to like avoid confusion in a particular spot? So I think that kind of goes along with the examples, but it's kind of a 2-for-1, because you also get a sense for what that process typically is from an observer. Obviously that might be a lot harder when it comes to privacy. and other, you need to have consent of people recorded and whatnot. But I think that would be super useful. I also have listed here since we're talking about the next generation of collaborative statisticians, I was thinking, well, what are some next gen tools for team science that we could help our students learn about? And I think one of them was already mentioned, Shiny apps. So anything that allows real-time data exploration and kind of interactivity with data is super, super helpful in the statistical consulting environment. And it kind of solves or makes the problem less bad of email lag, which is pretty frequent, where projects get delayed because we're waiting on decisions to be made over email, and not everyone is or should be expected to be on their email all the time. So yeah, and I think the reason I kind of focused on that is I really think communicating uncertainty is kind of the ubiquitous kind of struggle that we all deal with as practicing statisticians. How do you really communicate uncertainty well, which is generally something that humans aren't great at understanding. So I think we can get better at training new consultants to kind of identify, measure, and translate uncertainties in the data analysis process to collaborators. I also have here balancing deadlines. This is more of a subjective thing. I think it is possible to like balance deadlines well, given, or like another thing I'm trying to say here is like scoping out how much time something is going to take someone, given that there are existing deadlines. So I think that's a lot easier to do well if you have experience with how long things take you, but our students don't have experience with how long things take them, right? So I think better, maybe evidence-based guidance on determining how much effort and time a particular project is going to last would certainly benefit junior researchers. And then finally, reproducibility. Emily Slade mentioned some great resources on that. I think a lot of the material out there for reproducibility is really focused on software development or kind of things where it's, I like what that title was, which is what's good enough for statistical consulting. I feel like that is a heavy focus too, because it is important, but you don't need everything to be, containerized and able to be fully reproduced and have, a completely reproducible workflow every single time. So yeah.
Great, and thank you, Ryan. I would like to mention something that came in through the Q&A that may be underutilized, and that is inviting practicing consultants to come and speak in classes. So I have done that in the past, invited statistical collaborators, private statistical collaborators to come speak into my class. Emily Griffith mentioned inviting industry folks. Do any of you others invite individual statistical consultants to your classes to come and speak to your students?
I have before, yes, but I agree that the students definitely get benefit from this, and it really helps offer great exposure to different types of careers in statistics as well. So more of this is definitely better.
Julia, I have not, but I think it's a wonderful idea, and I look forward to doing that.
Great, thank you. And thanks for that comment in the Q&A. We appreciate that. How can statistical consulting resources complement on-the-job training? How does this type of training benefit your students and your institutions? So Ryan is up next.
All right. Yeah, so I think on-the-job training is pretty vital as well as, it's where most of us learn how to do statistical consulting, but I feel like a lot of statistical consulting training resources certainly can complement that. I think in my experience, all of the students that I have are generally used to talking with statistically minded individuals and not used to talking to non-statisticians. And it's just way easier to communicate statistical topics with statistically minded individuals because the required knowledge, understanding, and the language that you use is already shared to an extent. So I think that skill involved with bringing a non-statistician up to speed on a core concept, at least these like core concepts that are minimally sufficient for the context, facilitates successful relationships and communication. And I really think that that's a skill set that is almost completely mutually exclusive of other more traditional statistics course content, and it's more teaching focused. And incidentally, me saying both mutually exclusive and minimally sufficient proves my point here, because the people on the call probably understand those, but they're terms that are pretty ingrained in our statistics brains, but not so much in statisticians. So on the job lessons, another thing to think about is you often are going to learn your lessons the hard way by learning on the job. So learning, and this creates friction both in terms of hurting people, in terms of more burnout or stress, also hurting institutions in terms of less productivity and more animosity. I think Emily Slade mentioned like this friction that sometimes occurs between students and funders, and where a funder isn't necessarily going to want the student to work on it, which is kind of hard, right? As has been mentioned, and that's the friction that you're trying to avoid by having a student learn the lesson the hard way or making mistakes without having learned lessons, what I call the easy way, by practicing and by learning these materials. So coursework and training reduces this friction by helping students learn lessons the easy way. It also facilitates just generally practice and interacting with non-statisticians, a skill that's not only vital to statistical consulting, but really vital to the success of students' careers and no matter what they do, I think. And generally it just leads to less friction for everybody.
The balance of the friction. I like it. Emily Slade.
Yeah, so I do think that while this is getting better over time, oftentimes in statistics programs, these kinds of consulting experiences are students' only opportunities to struggle with the realities of working with real data. Even in methods-focused courses that use real data sets, they're oftentimes like cleaned real data sets, right? And so we all know how different that is from the real stuff, right? And so from my experiences observing students going on the job market and things like that, what people interviewing these students really want to hear about is their experiences working, like doing the real stuff. And those experiences often come in these courses. And so it's just such an important experience for our students to have when they then are going, maybe this is before the on-the-job training, but when they're just trying to land the job, being able to speak to these experiences is so important for the students. And then I'll also add, as Ryan was just mentioning, tensions between funders and things like that. One way that we've gotten around this in our lab is that we can have students working on projects that are coming into our lab that a full-time staff biostatistician is going to be working on, and the student will kind of also be working on this separately, and that this gives them the opportunity then to compare notes with our full-time biostatistician. It can, if they're doing a similar analysis, it can act as a double programming experience for quality control purposes, which is a win-win for the student, for the staff member in our lab, and ultimately for the researcher to catch any kind of potential data cleaning or analysis errors that way. But if they end up taking very different approaches to the analysis, this can also be a really interesting topic of conversation to just discuss differing approaches to the same research question. And so this allows the students to be working on real problems as they come in and leading their work on those problems while still kind of touching base with someone employed in our lab who, is going to be ultimately responsible to, disseminate the information to the collaborator.
Great, thank you. Alex, did you want to add anything here?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. What is one key component that everyone should take away from this webinar to consider in their own statistical consulting teaching? So Alex, this is you.
That was me. Okay, great. So, as educators, we need to reiterate and to emphasize the importance of listening and being thoughtful, and really encourage students to continually ask questions. And it's critical that analyses are planned prospectively, and that we use a statistical analysis plan or a schema or whatever you want to call it. And we really need to emphasize ethics and then the practice of good science, right? So specifically, just teaching students to not jump directly into a complex model, but rather just sit down, listen, ask questions, think, visualize the data, generate your table 1, step through your bivariates and so on. And then when all is said and done with the primary analyses, I think we really need to teach the students to understand the importance of going back and, looking at their assumptions, checking their assumptions, and engaging in some sensitivity analyses. And then lastly, I think we need to emphasize the need to be deliberate and thoughtful and how our study results are translated and presented. Yep, thanks.
I love that. Thank you. Emily Griffith.
Yeah, so piggybacking on what Emily Slade said a minute ago, and to quote one of my students, real data are so annoying. And so that real data experience is vital. Students need to know that they're not going to get like perfectly clean data in a rectangular format every single time. And I think that getting that experience really makes the steps that Alex outlined seem more important, right? Because if the data are always fine, then maybe making table 1 first feels like just kind of a rote exercise instead of a really important step in the analysis process. And then the other thing that I like to emphasize, and I think things are changing and students are much more interested in consulting and collaborative work now than they were when I started as a faculty member. But that consulting skills and communication skills are useful beyond only consulting or collaborating as a statistician. And so if you're interested in talking about like your amazing theoretical results, if you can motivate them really clearly, that will help you, right? If you want to be in a leadership role, being able to explain ideas, being able to listen actively, being able to communicate effectively to different groups of people, that's all going to help you really, really importantly. Even like getting into diplomacy and conflict resolution and things like that. And so these skills are translatable. And that's something that I always try to emphasize.
Great points. Thank you both. In summary, then, each of our panelists will have a summary statement for the webinar, and then we'll take any questions that you have through the Q&A. So go ahead and line up your questions in there, and we'll start with Alex here.
Okay, great. So based on our discussion today, I would say that some successful approaches to teaching statistical collaboration might include the use of course, real world problems, role play, as well as contemporary teaching methods. And such methods might include the project-based learning, case-based learning, the use of the flipped format classroom, shadowing real life practice, certainly incorporating soft skills that we can take elsewhere. And I really like the idea that someone dropped in the chat, and that is really inviting some folks to share their real life consulting experiences out in the field. And that's what I got.
Thank you. Ryan?
Yeah, echoing that, I think the statistical consulting is really vital, I think, and the skills involved are vital for the next generation of statisticians in practice. I think a combination of didactic and on-the-job training improves students' career success, reduces stress and burnout, and makes programs and institutions more productive. I also just like that the teaching something like consulting, you are able to be more creative than a typical statistics course. There isn't going to be another statistics course where role play is is something that is done, probably, or video production is done. So I really think that it engages a different part of students' brains, and a part of their brains that really is vital to their future career success.
Great, thank you. I agree with engaging different parts of your brains by creating videos. Certainly takes a different skill set. Thank you. Emily Griffith.
Thanks. Yeah, so I just think students are really hungry for these real hands-on experiences. And so if you can figure out a way to provide that in your institution in a sustainable way, it's super satisfying. It's a high impact practice. It's well worth the effort. And you get to be part of the student's growth and development in a way that you don't necessarily get to be when you're teaching more of a methods class. At least in my experience. And that is also just really satisfying to see and to watch the students learn and grow during the semester.
Neat, thank you. And Emily Slade.
Thanks. Yeah, I think for me, I think that one thing that we really can't ignore is that many students experience fear as the overwhelming emotion during their first experiences with statistical consulting and collaboration. And so we talked about tons of different approaches to teaching these kinds of courses, but I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is that no matter the resources or modality used, that the most important thing for us as educators is to create a safe playground for students to have these experiences in, and really make the classroom environment such that the students feel like they can try and fail or be bad at something the first time they do that, and that's fine, and it's part of the process of learning. So I think that's really the most important thing, in my opinion.
That's a great point. Thank you. So finally, we have some resources, some of which I shared in the chat, many of which I shared in the chat. 2 pages of resources here, and we will send a PDF of these slides to the organizers, who will hopefully be able to link the recording with the slides so that you will have those resources available to you. And then one thing that I wanted to mention or address is a comment in the Q&A about putting out a call for practicing consultants to help with this, bringing them into the classroom, I think, is what that comment is about. So that is another way to get experts in our field into the classroom to help convey the message that there are different career paths and different ways to collaborate and consult as a statistician. So I just wanted to address that before I moved on to our questions slide to see if there are any questions.
Julia, I have a real basic question for Emily Griffith.
Sure.
Emily, you mentioned that your preferred group size for these teams, when students work in teams, is 2. But I would be curious to know, why that is and what others think too. Now, our CUBE program again officially launches this summer, and we've done in the past various group sizes, but I'm just curious what you all think and what your experience has been.
Yeah, so with my undergrads, I used to do groups of 4, and I switched to groups of 3 this semester, and they liked it better. There was one group of 2, they did not like being a group of 2. And so I think for undergrads, like 3 or 4 is probably better, but I worry with 4 that somebody can kind of hide What I've found with grad students is if you have a nervous student and they're in a bigger group, like a group of 3 or 4, they don't talk. And so I sort of feel like over the years, I've found that you have to kind of push, I hate to say that, but you have to kind of push them a little bit. And if you send 2 students to a meeting with a collaborator, like it's weird if one of them doesn't say anything. But if you send 3 students, it's less noticeable if one doesn't say anything. And so that's kind of why I've settled on 2. I get less complaints too with groups of 2 about like getting along and sharing work and stuff like that. But I'm open to other ideas.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you. I have a question from the chat, or from the Q&A, excuse me. How much oversight / supervision do you provide for students who are working with a collaborator in your course? Ryan, I will go with you first, please.
Okay. Well, the first time I brought in a collaborator, it was just one. It was a ongoing kind of 10-on-1 in that all of the students were in the class with me as we did the consultation. So I was there essentially kind of facilitating the discussion. This was early in the class, right? So they were kind of still learning the ropes to some extent. And then it was kind of an ongoing process where they would have an assignment to kind of scope out the project and perform the analysis. And the investigator returned several times throughout the course for kind of the 10-on-1 consult scenario. So students would take turns asking questions. I guess the remaining, I can only, that's really all I can speak to because I've only taught the first semester of the course, and the second semester of the course is the one with more of the real consultation. So if other people have integrated real consultations, perhaps they can speak to how they generally do it.
Emily Griffith.
Sure. My supervision is pretty light, but I do like when we solicit projects. One of the things that we mention is that you'll be working with a group of students who have never done this before. So heads up. I also email everybody at the beginning of the semester to let them know to let me know if there's an issue or a concern that arises. And then at the end of the semester, I send out a thank you email to everybody and also sort of follow up. So if something didn't get finished, or if they have follow-up questions or something like that, they can come to me. Luckily, that doesn't happen very much. And I also have the students turn in all of the data and code and reports that they have so that if there is something that needs to be double checked, I can do it fairly quickly.
Thank you. Emily Slade, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think it depends on who the client is and sort of what the format is of the consulting that's happening. So for instance, when I was in grad school, I ran a student-led consulting group, and because there was essentially little to no oversight on the consulting that was happening in that, the only clients that we allowed to participate in this were other students. So it was just like a student to student kind of advice giving session, I would say. And that's very different than like the class I teach now, which is trying to foster these deeper collaborative team science experiences with like real clinical investigators. So in that format, there's a lot more oversight. And so because I have the benefit of a very small class size, we rely a lot on peer review and evaluation. So the students can kind of have their initial consults, then come talk about them, present them to the class, and get feedback from their classmates on questions they may not have thought to ask and things like that. So it's kind of baked in oversight that also helps just more exposure to more examples in the class.
Great, thank you. I'll say in my experience, I was somewhere in between the Emilys. So when I was teaching statistical consulting in a directed sort of way, I would meet with the students and the clients at least once a month. That made sure for me that I knew what was going on in the project, that if they did give me the code, which I liked for them to give me the code and the report and everything at the end, just in case it came back to me, I knew what had happened along the way. So I like to get that sort of monthly feedback from the students and the collaborators, and I could also help answer questions and guide their meeting a little bit. Thank you. Do you have advice about how to find projects that will be interesting, but not too complex, and that will take approximately a semester to finish? What do you do if the research project, well, let's just go with that first question first. How do you get projects that are sort of bite-sized within a semester? Alex, we'll start with you.
Oh boy. Okay. So this is a great question. The one thing that we do is, all right, so we sometimes we actually even simulate our own projects. But one thing that we always do, and this is of course learning by experience, is we walk through the project in advance to make sure that there are no big roadblocks. And again, we're really starting to do this now for CUBE, really figure out, what works. Last summer when we were piloting, we were using the HCUPS data set, and it was so large that it actually took our server down. And it was the first time that the students, the one thing that they took away from the experience was they had never had to wait on even simple lines of code to run. And we had to come up with these different workarounds. But just to get back to your question, so, I think we use lots of times we'll take versions of de-identified electronic health record data sets. And then of course, early on in this discussion, Maria mentioned that there are quite a few resources here through this section. So I think that's really all I've got there, but we do simulate.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to respond to this?
Yeah, I guess I'll add that through my position, I'll actually have every so often I'll have people trying to get statistical consulting help for me or the people who work with me for free. And that's not always something that is possible, right? And that actually Julia and Emily and you guys produced a video about how to say as a consultant, you have to budget for statistics, right? Some people just don't understand that. So if I ever have that problem, that's one of my options is, I have a consulting class and we're looking for examples. And that way it's a win-win where students can kind of get that experience, and someone who doesn't have a budget to do a statistical analysis might be able to get expertise that can help with them with that. With that though, you still run into the issue that Alex mentioned, that the scope of the project, there's no guarantees about the scope of the project. You could simulate it. What we will often do in the second semester, as I understand, is really just set the expectation that this project may not get finished by the end of the semester, but some progress hopefully will be made.
Thank you. That leads to the follow-up question very nicely. What do you do if a project isn't finished at the end of that semester? Or on the flip side, what if it only takes them 2 weeks? What do you do in those cases? Anybody have a response?
I can jump in. Yeah. So if it's huge, so I don't vet the projects ahead of time, which is always a little exciting. So we've come up with a few common situations and I think fairly reasonable workarounds. So the first is if it's just absolutely too big, the students will figure that out pretty quickly because I have them turn in their notes from their first meeting and write an introduction and describe sort of what the plan is. And at that point, we'll work through how do you, like what is doable, what's feasible during the semester, what are the students able to do well, and we'll pitch that back, right? You can apply to work with the class again. Here are some other resources on campus. We can do this part for you now. And that's been pretty successful. If the project is too small, if it's way too small, then they get another project. If something goes wrong though, and it ends up being too small because like there's no data after all, or the data aren't here yet, or something like that, we've had pretty good luck with students sort of simulating some data, and then what they provide the collaborator with instead of results is very well documented code with an analysis plan, and some sample data that they can run through and see how it works, with the idea being that then when the data get here, whatever, when everything works out, they're more empowered to do the analysis themselves. And so if a project is more simple statistically, sometimes even maybe the collaborator really doesn't know that much. And so then the students can do like a tutorial for them, or they can help teach them some concepts or something like that. And that can still be a really rewarding experience, even if it's not like the right level of model. But I tried to vet projects one semester and I did not do a good job. And so now I just sort of like let things happen. And then we work with whatever that looks like.
I'll add a little bit here too. So my advice would be try to find like a pocket of researchers on campus who have similar types of projects that you know are good for the class. So this takes trial and error for sure. But for us doing more biomedical applications, we've learned over time that the medical residents all are required to do research, and they're typically small projects because they're unfunded. And those almost always last like exactly a semester for the students. And so just by trial and error, we've kind of learned that that's a good group to work with in terms of the size and scope of the project. So that can be one way too. I've also tried in the past partnering with specific like research methods focused classes and other PhD programs where those students are kind of having a controlled experience on their side with getting into their research projects. And so that can help have this like nice team science match there. But yeah, that can be one way to do this without having to vet the project so deeply, is to kind of find a group up front that you know is going to be in the right realm.
I agree. That's oftentimes how I found projects, was with particular groups. Great. We have two more questions. The first question is, in an academic environment, we have typically had to do budgets. What skills are taught to the students to devise budgets for short projects and grants? And I'm just going to say that this can occur outside of academia as well. So sort of estimating time or estimating costs, the time cost balance. How or what are we teaching students to help devise those budgets? Alex, do you have a thought here?
You know, we do not teach that. Probably the closest I get is through your role play scenarios, right? That is hard budgeting, but I do oftentimes in our informal setting find myself asking students or trainees approximately, how long they think, which is we all know that's a loaded question. I don't remember what the metric is, Julia, but remember the one webinar where it was like, well, that's times, it keeps going up for me. You'll say, oh, what was it?
Yeah, some people say 2, I say 5.
Yeah, I'm going up and up, but really it's like, even, as so many years of doing this, being a collaborating biostatistician, and thinking, oh, well, I think that project will probably take around 40 hours. It's still at least double usually. Things take so much longer, but I think that it's such an art. No, we don't incorporate it into the curriculum. And again, we are just, in terms of our formal teaching, again, it's a single semester, which I really think it needs to go into 2. And that's probably one aspect that really needs to be folded into the training. Very important.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Are any of us teaching budgeting in our classes?
So I don't teach it like directly, but one thing I do teach the students to do is how to talk to their collaborators about the need to think about budgeting in the future, because what I don't want is for collaborators to come to have this experience working with one of our students and then leave with the impression that biostatistics collaboration is free, because it was for them in that moment. And so I do have our students always have conversations with the collaborators about the need to have these types of conversations with your biostatistician up front about what they estimate their time to be in, just kind of having more awareness around the need to do that in the future. But I know I don't teach it really like directly, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap 2 questions, or 1 comment and a question, into one. So we kind of talked about how data are not always rectangular. They're often messy. And so we have to be prepared to encounter, and we have to prepare students to encounter that type of data. In the same sense, people are not always in the great frame of mind to meet with a statistical collaborator, right? And sometimes people think, oh, it's like going to the dentist or something similar. So in those circumstances and in other circumstances, how are students taught to either hold their own in a polite, professional way, or contact their supervisor for advice if an investigator tries to bulldoze the student? So that's a very specific example. Who would like to talk about this? Emily Griffith.
Okay, yeah, so I have a great set of training materials from our libraries. They have a data help desk, and I work very closely with them, and the Data Science Academy program coordinates with our libraries. And so I've borrowed from that. So credit needs to go to Data and Visualization Services. But they go through with their students, and I use the ASA ethical guidelines for like sort of ethical ways of talking to each other, and ethical considerations, and then also sort of workplace norms, and that this isn't a workplace, right? So like you do not need to be yelled at in a meeting, and things like that. And I think bringing it up proactively at the beginning of the semester when we're talking about how to hold a meeting, and telling the students that they can end a meeting if it's not going well, role playing that, and then also letting them know that if something happens, that like I will relish the opportunity to step in on their behalf, and sort of correct that behavior or find them a new group to work with. And I haven't had to do it very much. I have had to do it a couple times, and so I'm really glad that I used those materials. I think really just saying that, right? Like if you're feeling like you're not being listened to, if you're, whatever, like I can go to a meeting with you and sort of observe how things are going. That often changes the dynamic anyway. Or, if you have, if you're rattled after a meeting, that's bad. And that's not a good experience for the students. And so then what can we do to fix that and make it work? And so, yeah, so I think just bringing it up proactively, and then making sure that you listen if the students do come to you with something. And then you have to kind of be helpful since they came to you about it.
Thank you. Ryan, were you going to add anything?
Yeah, I was going to bring up, there's a really nice framework that you may have heard of by Doug Zahn, and later I think Eric Vance talked about it, POWER it's called. So this is when you're meeting with an investigator. It's kind of how to organize your meeting, and P is prepare, O is open, W is do the work, or work. E is end the meeting, and R is reflect. And I feel like if you prepare mentally for the meeting, like the mental preparation is a big one, because that kind of puts you in the right mental space to be respectful, and kind of it makes you mindful of kind of where you're coming from a mental point, which is very, very important. And then the final one, reflect, is also super important, because if something bad did happen, that's usually it doesn't necessarily register right away, and it really pays to kind of spend 15 minutes to kind of document what happened, maybe go to your supervisor if necessary. So that I would bring that into it. As far as the in terms of holding their own, I guess I'm going to talk about like on the job training for the research assistants that we have, who are generally, they do have more responsibilities than the students in our class, and they have more expectations from investigators. So I feel like they're more at risk, I guess, of being bulldozed to some extent. A policy that we have in my center is essentially that all communication has to have me or the supervisor CC'd. And if an investigator tries to get around that, then the student is supposed to CC, like re-CC the supervisor. And so there is like a supervisor always involved in the communication loop. And that does actually help catch kind of these situations where student is being bulldozed, because that's not good for anybody.
Yeah, and it can certainly be hard on the students if they're fairly new in the program to be confident to speak up. So great questions. Anybody else want to speak to that question?
Yeah, so in our group, so we it would be more of the informal training for my team members when they come on board. And early on, we just make sure that that we're meeting with investigators in teams with more senior members versus younger, and just trying to get a feel for where the trainees are, where they excel, where they're strong, where they might not be so comfortable. There have been a couple times, we have several investigators that do love to bulldoze. And so there have been a couple times where after meetings, I would have to have follow-up meetings with investigators themselves. And, the other thing that I find interesting is that I have seen my team members in the past, not often, but get really shaken up or rattled in a meeting or following a meeting. And the one thing that's interesting is that, as we all know, as people, we're all so different, that a really difficult investigator might not really work well with one of my team members at all, but another who I would never have imagined just completely connects with that investigator. So it's sort of matchmaking too. And we try to establish programs of work. So if there's one of our team members who's really sort of loving and digging the work that they're doing with an investigator, build that program with them, and they establish these long-term relationships. And of course, that's good for the science itself too. But yeah, the bulldozing is tough.
Great. Thank you for that response. And thank you for all of the great questions in the Q&A. We really appreciate that. I'd like to again thank our panelists. Great webinar today. I always learn something new from each of you, and I really appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maria to go over our last slide here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our moderator and all of our panelists for putting together this session. The questions, the answers were great. And this webinar has been recorded. So as soon as the recording's available, you'll receive an email notification with the link to the video and the slides. If you aren't a member of the TSHS yet, please visit our website, our blog, and our resources portal to see the resources that we have available to the members, and please consider joining. Okay, thanks everyone. Till next time.